So hello everyone and welcome back to the NeuroCalm Fatigue Summit, and I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today Alex Howard, who's founder and chairman of the Optimum Health Clinic, or the OHC, one of the world's leading integrative medicine clinics specialising in fatigue. With a team of 25 full-time practitioners supporting literally thousands of patients in over 50 countries, the OHC team has pioneered working with patients remotely since 2004. Now, Alex has also published academic research in publications such as the British medical journal Open and Psychology and Health. He's the author of Why Me? My Journey from ME to Health and Happiness, and of Decode Your Fatigue, a clinically proven 12-step plan to increase your energy, heal your body, and transform your life. Alex is creator of the therapeutic coaching methodology, and since March 2020 has been documenting his therapeutic work with real-life patients via his In Therapy with Alex Howard YouTube series. In the last few years, Alex has created some of the largest online conferences in the health and mind-body markets, including the Fatigue Super Conference, Anxiety Super Conference, and the Trauma Super Conference. And Alex's online conferences have been attended by over 500,000 people. Alex, incredibly impressive, and it's wonderful to have you here. So thank you for joining us.
Hi, Anna. I'm looking forward to our time together, so thank you for having me.
Me too. Now, Alex, I think you're uniquely placed to have a big picture overview of fatigue internationally and more personally and collectively in terms of shifts in human awareness and so on. And I'm wondering what your experience is of fatigue as a wake-up call to individuals, and what your sense is of the ratio of people who actually find that fatigue is a profound life transformer.
It's a great question. I think it is impossible to go through a significant fatigue experience without being touched and impacted by it in some way. I think most people's reaction when they first experience debilitating fatigue, obviously we're talking about something more than just being a little bit kind of tired at the end of the day, but some sort of debilitating fatigue, is we want to get things back to the way that they were before. And so be that via mainstream medical approaches, be it via alternative approaches, but for most people initially, we have a measure of what health was before, and that's what we're trying to get back to. What often happens for people is if they go on a journey with it, they come to realize that in many cases, the very model they had of health and wellness before was part of the reason why they ended up having to go on the journey that they're going on. That in of itself, I think, is quite difficult, because you don't want to be where you are because you're living with all these symptoms, but you sort of can't go back, but you don't necessarily know exactly where it is that you're going and what that means and what that looks like. I think there are some people who fully and truly and embrace that journey, and they do that relatively easily. There are others where, and I include myself in this category, where we were or we are dragged kicking and screaming along on that journey. And you know, for people that make recovery and come through the other side, for some people that is a real sense of the whole world looks different. How we see ourselves is different, how we see other people is different, how we relate is different. And other people, they wouldn't necessarily talk about it in such existential terms, but I don't think it's possible to go through such a difficult experience and not have a different relationship to life. It might just be that we couldn't do things that we love for many years, and now we can, and we have a new appreciation, and we have a new kind of valuing of that. If I when I was did my psychology degree back in, I think I graduated in sort of 20 years ago, exactly. I was in the later stages of my own recovery from ME chronic fatigue, and we had to do a research project as the kind of final year dissertation. And I wanted to obviously do something on ME chronic fatigue, and the research that I did was to go out and do qualitative interviews of I think it was 10 different people that either actively had ME chronic fatigue syndrome or had recovered from ME chronic fatigue syndrome. And part of those interviews was to look at what are the themes that come out of those interviews and those people's experiences, and what are the identity changes that come with that. And I don't think the term had been coined at the time, so I didn't write about it in these terms at the time. But ultimately, what several of the people that had recovered were describing was what we now call post-traumatic growth. People talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, that you go through something that's really stressful and difficult. But there's also, we grow through challenge, and we grow through difficult experience. And so when that eventually that research was published in Psychology and Health, I think it was in 2011 or 2012, that term post-traumatic growth had then been coined, and that became one of the themes of that research. And so that can be the gift of going through these experiences. And I recognize that a percentage of people watching this want to smack me in the face right now, and I understand why.
So to get them really more riled up, what about peri-traumatic growth? So the growth that occurs in the experience, because post-traumatic implies kind of afterwards you're looking back going, yeah, well, that was interesting and I've grown in these respective ways. But what about when we're actually in it, when we're right in the mess?
We're going to lose a few more people. That's okay. We're having an honest conversation about it. It's interesting. We all have different philosophies for life. Some of us, we have conscious philosophies. We might have an unconscious philosophy, but we have a philosophy for how we make meaning out of life. And I think for a lot of us, the temptation can be to want to get to a place of ease and comfort in our life. And I remember when I was ill, the thing I wanted was not to be ill. And then when I was well, and then I got in a very stressful time in my business life, I just wanted to be calm. At one point I wanted to go and move and live on a beach in Goa. But what I've come to realize, certainly for me in my life, is that whether I like it or not, I'm actually most engaged and most alive in life when I'm challenged. And the way that I talk about it a lot these days is separating two things. Separating safety from comfort. That we need to feel safe. And I think that is a fundamental human need. And that safety looks like being able to self-regulate our nervous system, being able to be in a calm, healing state. But that isn't the same as always feeling comfortable in life, always getting what we want, and always having our needs met. Like at the extreme of that, every need we ever want is met immediately. What kind of life is that? I see in my kids, 2 of my 3 kids, and the third is too young to know at this point, are neurodiverse. And particularly my eldest daughter has significant challenges when it comes to learning. And as a parent, a part of me just wants to take all that challenge away. But another part of me recognizes how beautiful she becomes through growing with that struggle and that challenge. And so it's easy for me to sit here and talk about the value of challenge and struggle when I have my health and I have lots of things in my life I can be grateful for. And I recognize how grating that is going to be for some people. But I also recognize that a lot of the things I have in my life now have come from struggle. And the end, it's a bit like people have this idealization that if I have a certain amount of money, or I have a certain relationship, or I have a certain achievement in life, then I will be happy. And yet most people that have achieved big things in their life look back and they realize they were happiest when they were going through the struggle. And that struggle needs not to be completely overwhelming. And we need to be able to have humor and have play and have love and connection and support along the way. But we get to know ourselves and we get to have depth of connection with others when life is challenging us.
And obviously, if things are too comfortable, we don't grow, and ultimately that undermines our capacity to be safe, because actually life can be very unpredictable. So you could be in cotton wool, as it were, and have a very underdeveloped capacity for resilience, for adaptation, etc. As you say, there's a sort of balance there, isn't there, between adequate hormetic stresses that cause us to grow and overwhelm. And the overwhelm is what's destructive, which is where we come to issues like therapeutic meditation, because what tools, Alex, and I think therapeutic meditation is one of the ones you love, can people use to actually evolve that capacity to be comfortable with discomfort and to understand that discomfort is not inherently destructive in a human life.
Yeah, well, I think that what's really at the heart of what you're saying is that capacity to be present and the capacity to self-regulate our nervous system. So this is something that has been a fascination of mine for 25 years now, for a whole bunch of different reasons. So originally, the fascination was being on a healing journey and recognizing I wasn't in a healing state. And for the body to heal, it has to be in a healing state. And I'm sure there's many others that have talked about this as part of this event. But at the heart of really my thesis and all of that is that the body can be in two states, a state of stress or a state of healing. If it's in a state of stress, it's not healing. And so learning how to cultivate that healing state was really important for me on my healing journey. But then what I came to realize was I could be in a healing state in certain environments and certain situations. But then let's take the area of relationships. I had a whole load of relational trauma and stuff from childhood, and I've got my physical health back, but I was incompetent of having a lasting, intimate relationship that had depth because I wasn't able to really be present in the moment. I had all these masks and all these ways that I was trying to kind of protect myself and be safe. So it became a fascination of how do you build safety and the ability to be truly present in the moment, not being activated by past traumas and so on in relationship. The same thing in my work life. You know, something like this, doing an interview, going back a number of years, would have been a whole anxiety and a whole stress. And for better or for worse, it isn't anymore. So I'm just kind of garbling out what comes to my mind in the moment. But the ability to be able to be present to whatever moment it is that we're in, and to be able to self-regulate and to not be dependent upon external things, be that pharmaceuticals, of course they have their place, recreational drugs, constantly need to be stimulated, needing a disproportionate amount of emotional support from other people, all these different ways that we can try to compensate from a lack of inner safety, often that just perpetuate the cycles of suffering that we're experiencing, as opposed to having ways, and it's not always simple and it's not always easy, but having ways of effectively resetting our nervous system and being able to train ourselves to be present and to be here, which is where life is happening. So our capacity for joy, our capacity for aliveness is enhanced, but also our capacity for doing what matters most to us is also enhanced, because our resources are here, not in the past or trying to anticipate and control a future that may or may not happen.
And when we think about contemporary life conditions, there's just so much in the way that we live, particularly in the consumer West, driven by the forces of neoliberalism and so on, that militate against that being present to what gives us joy. I mean, when you think about how hard the average person has to work, the stresses that families are under, the economic stresses, all sorts of social relational stresses, it becomes really critical then, doesn't it, to start thinking more collectively about how we do this as a community, how we become more present. And I personally think that those with fatigue are like the torch carriers for something new. And I just wonder if you've ever thought about that, Alex. I'm sure you have, and I'm sure you've got thoughts on the collective implications of fatigue.
Lots of places we could go here, so you might want to redirect me.
Just go wherever you want.
You know, there are two things that come to mind. Firstly, I want to respond to what you were saying about the circumstances of life that we deal with. I think that's really important, and I think it's very easy for people that have safe and comfortable lives to miss, and often they're people in power, and often they're people making big decisions, to misunderstand the reality of people that don't live in that way. Yeah. So I'll give you an example from my own personal life, which is obviously the easiest place for me to reference. That I, in my 20s, did a lot of therapeutic work, and in that work was in some ways invited to kind of hold accountable my parents for my childhood and things happen in my life. And of course, there's a place of that's appropriate. So I had a lot of anger towards my mother because I felt that I didn't get my emotional needs met. I didn't feel she was present to me in the ways that would have been in some ways preferable. And then I had my own kids, and I kind of experienced a bit more of the world. And I came to realize that, my mother was a single parent for many years. She had to try and do 3 jobs to try and have enough money to literally survive. She had no emotional support. She had a lot of different pressures and burdens on her in different ways. And it's a miracle that she did what she did. And so that perspective shift, I think, is very important, because I think it's very easy for people to sit in judgment of others and measure them to the same yardstick without recognizing that there's 2 very different realities. And if I think how challenging parenting is, where there is financial stability, there is a loving marriage and support, there is additional care and support and friendships and family and stuff around, how someone does that without that is a miracle, and that is an incredibly difficult thing. So first I want to just respond to that point around it's very easy for us to sit in judgment, and it's very easy to think that everyone's on a level playing field. And that's not true. And that's also not true in terms of one of my big journeys around particularly understanding neurodiversity over recent years is to recognize that certain things that may be very easy for one person are almost impossible for somebody else. And understanding and recognizing that, I think, is incredibly important. To go back to I think the deeper point in your question, I think I've always felt that ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, these days long COVID, Lyme disease, these sort of complex fatigue conditions are a micro example of what is happening on a macro level within our environment, within our within our society, within the ways that we live and we're expected to live, and the expectations that people have. Because we are, as a society, and how we are with our planet and with our economics at this point as well, living in a way that is fundamentally unsustainable. And when something is fundamentally unsustainable, at some point something has to snap. And what happens for many people on the fatigue journey is they've lived in a way that's unsustainable, and not because necessarily they've been a kind of overtly obvious kind of monster achiever and driven person. Maybe there's lots of burdens on their system. Maybe those burdens are that someone's suffering from mold exposure and they've got mycotoxins that are going on, or maybe there's Lyme disease, or maybe there's certain adverse childhood experiences and traumas that have happened. So there's loads that are happening on someone's system. There's then whether or not there's the right environmental support and holding, and that has a big impact on how these things may or may not impact us. But over time, that becomes too many burdens, too many loads on a boat, or to mix my metaphors, the final straw that breaks the camel's back. And the problem then that you have is you haven't just got all the burdens of things that happened. You've now got an additional burden, which is that you've got the burden of trying to fix it. You've also got the available energy before to meet life was maybe this, and now it's maybe this, but you still got the same basic life stuff that's happening. And so when someone's in a crash, there's a significant readjustment that has to happen, but there's also healing from the past, calming the system now, problem solving what's going on, mapping a pathway forwards. And that going back to your original question, that's obviously a big life journey that someone has to go on to do all of that. What does that mean at a planetary level? I think it's pretty scary. One of my, as someone that has deep concern about the environment, one of the things that scares me most about the environment is the unsustainability of the economy. Because if we haven't got finances in place, we can't invest in the things we need to do to be able to play a role in fixing what's happening or trying to address what's happening in the environment. So these are very complex things that have lots of pieces that are interrelated. But the micro and the macro is, to me, the same basic principle of lack of sustainability.
The patterns are there, aren't there, all the way through. And everything you were saying when you're talking about, healing the past, going back to traumas, you can think about that socio-historically. You can think that about that collective trauma, you know, and the kind of enactment of trauma on ecosystems. You can take that model that you just mentioned that we apply to ourselves as individuals and apply it at a planetary, social, political, economic, etc. level. So there's a fundamental wisdom, isn't there here, Alex? There's a fundamental wisdom in fatigue. There's a fundamental teaching that fatigue is bringing, especially to those of us who deal with it, but potentially for wider society too.
Yeah, you know, a couple of ways I would think about it. One of which is you can't solve a problem until you have really diagnosed a problem. And you can't diagnose a problem unless you have real honesty and transparency in terms of what's going on. So I think a very simple way to look at this is in relationship. If you've got two people that are in an intimate relationship together, and one of those people is having an affair, for example, you're not going to be able to solve the issues in that relationship until there's honesty and transparency about that, but also why. There may be lots of complex reasons about why that's happening. And it's very difficult to, you know, one of the reasons why I called my second book on fatigue, Decode Your Fatigue, was you can't map a pathway to recovery until you decode and you name exactly what's happening. You know, the other thing that I would say from a kind of, you know, macroeconomic point of view, from an environmental point of view, these are areas that I'm not an expert. You know, my expertise is working as a clinician. So I have an enthusiastic interest, but you know more than I do about these things. But one of the ways I look at it is things have to be sustainable. So that means from a health point of view, one of the things that we talk a lot about is really finding out where your baseline is, having a sustainable, and if you're booming and busting the whole time, you don't have a foundation for recovery. So the first thing you do is you've got to build that baseline, and then you have to get the things that are going to support healing. And then as energy increases, to gradually bounce those boundaries. It strikes me that the same thing must be true on a kind of environmental level and an economic level, that you have to be sustainable. So, you know, just as a nation, like borrowing more and more money. Like, so one of our principles in running the businesses is we don't like debt. We don't like things being unsustainable. And so we don't have debt as a business. We also don't have investors as a business. We grow organically based upon the resources that we have. I'm not somebody who is particularly into buying stuff. And so when we do well, we put it all back in. And that's why we've been able to invest in things like the YouTube series, and which is quite a big investment in different things that we do. So this principle around sustainability is true on a physical health journey. It's true on a macroeconomic level. It's true in relationships, but it's hard because it requires discipline. It requires patience. It requires deferred gratification. You know, one of the biggest lessons I think people have on a fatigue recovery path is, let's say you've had a crash and you've rested up a lot. You've figured out why you had the crash. You're getting in more of a healing state. And then one day you have a little bit more energy. What is the temptation to do on that day, given the frustration of all the things you've not been able to do? Yeah. The temptation is to go, like, you want to just live life. But if you get too carried away, you just crash again. And that's the boom and bust cycle. It takes a lot of self-discipline, awareness, patience to be able to break those cycles.
Absolutely. And a profound relationship with the self, actually. You know, an incredible level of internal attunement to what's actually going on in the self, in order that you're not taken over by drives, in order that you can see where things are emerging and hold them in a spacious awareness, not give in to them, come from a different kind of wisdom. It's part of the journey, isn't it? So Alex, I want to ask you a question about what's your passion? What really drives you with this work? Where's your heart in this? Because you seem a very heartful person to me, and I'm just intrigued to know how you would distill the essence of what it is that really calls you forward.
No one's asked me that question before. I gotta think about that. I like to challenge myself. It kind of goes back to your first question. I have a lot of energy, and I like to spend that energy doing things that I genuinely care about. So on one hand, I'm the most patient person I know. And on the other hand, I'm the most impatient person I know. So I get very impatient when I feel like time is just being wasted away. I am very driven by doing things that I feel like have a positive impact. for me, that real focus is working with people. I have a significant personal interest in systems and politics and that sort of thing, but I don't bring that into my work because that isn't my area of speciality. I do think it's all interconnected. At the moment, a lot of my focus is around growing the teams within the organization to be able to impact and reach more people. And so a lot of my focus and a lot of the conversations I have with my team is around building a culture internally that reflects the values that we have. And we've had many opportunities over the years to grow more quickly, but I felt that it would have lost the integrity of the products. I always say that the products have to be better than the marketing of the products. So when I say the products, I mean the clinic and the professional training courses we do and the conferences we do and so on. And I want to wake up each day and I want to feel like I'm growing, and I want to feel like I'm surrounded by other people which want to be growing as well.
Yeah, brilliant. So we're running out of time now, Alex, and I'd love you to say just one thing to the audience about, if you had a message of hope or a practical insight for people right where they are, and it's difficult because they're all in different places and stages, but if there was one thing, one pearl of wisdom that you've drawn from all your experience and all the kind of macro patterns you've seen, what would it be?
The bad news is there is no one answer. There is no single answer to recovery. And that is the frustration, and that's the difficulty a lot of people are battling with. The good news is there are many answers. Different answers work for different people at different stages of recovery in different ways. And so if you've tried lots of things where someone's saying this is the answer or this is the thing that makes difference for everyone, and it hasn't worked for you, you're probably in the masses, you're not alone. You may just feel like you're alone because often the silos that we end up living in and the disconnection we can have from others on the same journey. For me, the key, and I'm very deliberate in how I word and name things. I spent a lot of time thinking about the title of the book, Decode Your Fatigue. And I know that it wasn't the title that was going to sell the most books. I know that it wasn't the best title from a publishing point of view, but for me, it was the most honest title in terms of what I think is so important. And to find the answers that are going to work for us, we have to take the time to understand the different interplaying factors. And there is enormous hope in that. I don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers for everyone that I work with. That's part of the growth. That's why I like doing the work that I do, because I keep learning from people. But it is amazing what is possible when we get clarity and we get the right support and we get the right pathway forwards. And as difficult as it may have been for people, one of the things that I find is when I work with someone that's done a lot of things that haven't worked, and they may feel very despondent about that, from a practitioner point of view, it's incredibly helpful because it tells me all the paths it's not going to be helpful to go down. And because there's many paths, that gives us more clarity of what is more likely to be helpful going the next step.
No, that's wonderful. So what I'm hearing is the pearl of wisdom there is to acknowledge the complexity and stay with the journey and know that it will. There are paths, even if you haven't found them yet.
One of the things that people often say is, I've tried everything. And I'm a little bit cheeky sometimes and say, oh my God, how was the mountain? And what do you mean? That mountain in Tibet that you spent 30 years up? Because I always wanted to go and meditate on a mountain in Tibet. And they sometimes look at me with humor. Other times they look at me like daggers in their eyes and sort of a genuine irritation that I'm trying to be too playful. But there are so many things. Like the amount that we've learned as a clinic just in the last couple of years is extraordinary. There is constantly new clinical insight. There is new research. There is now proper money behind some of the research because of long COVID. And I know there's frustrations, people that have been ill for many years, that it's taken that to make a difference. But there is enormous growth and understanding, and it's complex. And that's why working with skilled practitioners is often helpful and important. But there are absolutely pathways forward for people.
Yeah, which is a fantastic note to end the interview on. And I know you've got a gift for the audience, Alex, and we'll link it below the video when it goes out. I believe, is it a link to your reset program or something?
Yeah, I'm going to ad lib on the spot. I'm guessing what it is. So I have a 12-week online coaching program, which is all about how to reset your nervous system and ultimately cultivate the healing state, which has an enormous impact on supporting healing. And our philosophy as an organization has been, rather than spending money on advertising and marketing, to put out the best information we can for free. And then if people can see if something is a resonance or a fit for them. So there is a free 3-part video series on the effectively understanding the impact of a maladaptive stress response on the physical body, understanding the ingredients of that stress response, and ultimately what the reset model is to reset the system. And that video series, we've had tens of thousands of people watch it, and many, many times people say this is the first time I've really understood how this all ties together. So yeah, that's a great place to go deeper into what we've been
doing. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex. I'm really grateful, and I want to thank you on behalf of everyone watching for a fantastic interview. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.